Welcome back. Last week, we looked at Bruce Golding, the man who broke with the Jamaica Labour Party, built the National Democratic Movement, returned to the JLP, became its leader, and finally became Prime Minister in 2007. However, by 2011, the pressure had become enormous. Bruce Golding announced that he was stepping down. And when he walked away, Jamaica was confronted with a question. Who could possibly take over a wounded Jamaica Labour Party and convince the country to trust it again? The answer was a man few Jamaicans, just a decade earlier, would have imagined standing at the gates of Jamaica House. He didn't come from one of Jamaica's great political families. He didn't inherit a famous surname. He wasn't the son of a prime minister. He wasn't born into wealth or a political dynasty. And unlike every prime minister who had come before him, he wasn't even born when Jamaica became independent. Yet, that young man would eventually do something no Jamaica Labour Party leader before him had ever done: lead the party to 3 consecutive general election victories. His name, Dr. Andrew Michael Holness. Welcome back to part 8 of our 9-part series on the Prime Ministers of Jamaica. This is the ultimate thriller, and perhaps there's no better Prime Minister with whom to approach the ending of this series, because unlike every leader we have examined so far, Andrew Holness' story is still being written. This week we are looking at the boy from Spanish Town who became Jamaica's youngest Prime Minister, lost the office almost as quickly as he received it, fought his way back, survived a challenge for the leadership of his own party, returned to Jamaica House by the narrowest of parliamentary margins, and ultimately transformed himself into the dominant Jamaican political figure of his generation. But before elections, before Jamaica House, before the motorcades, before the controversies, and long before anyone called him Prime Minister, there was simply a boy born in a working-class family in Spanish Town, St. Catherine. Andrew Michael Holness was born on July 22, 1972. His father was a farmer, his mother was a civil servant, and the year of his birth is important because 1972 was also the year Michael Manley swept to power in Jamaica. In fact, Holness's official biography records a remarkable detail. His father, who held socialist sympathies, wanted his son named Michael in honor of Manley's victory. His mother objected. She wanted her son to have an identity of his own. So he became Andrew Michael Holness. And there's something almost poetic about that. A child whose father admired Michael Manley's rise would grow up to lead the party that stood on the opposite side of Jamaica's great political divide. But there was an even greater historical distinction waiting for him. You see, Andrew Holness was born 10 years after independence. That meant that when he eventually became Prime Minister, he would become the first Jamaican born after independence to lead the country. He attended St. Catherine High School, where the signs of leadership appeared early. He became head boy, president of the chess club, and valedictorian. Later, he went to the University of the West Indies, Mona, studying management studies and development studies. Years later, Holness recalled arriving at UWI not knowing exactly where the money for his education would come from. His mother was earning a civil servant's salary. His father promised to help him, and somehow the family made it work. There was no obvious road from that young man's circumstances to Jamaica House. But then Andrew Holness entered social work. And after that, he met Edward Seaga. That meeting would change the direction of his life. In 1995, Edward Seaga brought the young Andrew Holness into his office as a personal assistant, where Holness worked on issues involving poverty reduction and social investment. Holness was now inside the political machine. And just 2 years later, at only 25 years old, he made the decision that would begin one of the longest parliamentary careers in modern Jamaican politics. He ran for parliament. The constituency was West Central St. Andrew. The year was 1997, and Andrew Holness was about to find out whether people were prepared to gamble on a 25-year-old political newcomer. They were. He won. But let's put that victory into context. Andrew Holness entered Parliament during a terrible period for the Jamaica Labour Party. The PNP under P.J. Patterson was politically dominant. The JLP had suffered another crushing general election defeat. So Holness did not arrive in Parliament as some young superstar destined for Jamaica House. He arrived as a 25-year-old opposition MP in a party struggling to find its way back to power. And for the next decade, he learned politics from the opposition benches. Between 1999 and 2000, Holness served at different times as opposition spokesman on land and development, housing and education. Education, however, became particularly important because before Jamaicans knew Andrew Holness as the man talking about highways, economic growth, crime, housing, and prosperity, many knew him as the education man. And then, in 2007, everything changed. After 18 years of PNP government, Bruce Golding led the Jamaica Labour Party back to power in September 2007. Andrew Holness retained West Central St. Andrew. Golding appointed him Minister of Education. This was an important promotion. Holness was no longer criticizing government policy from the opposition benches. Now he had to deliver, and education was not a minor portfolio. Jamaica was wrestling with literacy, school performance, inequality within the education system, unattached youth, and the uncomfortable reality that too many Jamaican children were leaving school without the skills they needed to compete in the world. Holness began building his reputation around reform. His tenure became associated with initiatives aimed at literacy, school accountability, leadership, and alternative pathways for students. And something else was happening quietly. Andrew Holness was becoming one of the younger faces of the Jamaica Labour Party's future. But I doubt even he imagined how quickly that future was about to arrive. Because 4 years after Bruce Golding appointed him to cabinet, Bruce Golding was preparing to leave. By 2011, the political damage from the Christopher Dudus-Coke extradition affair had taken toll on Mr. Golding and his administration. And so he announced that he would resign as Prime Minister and leader of the Jamaica Labour Party. Suddenly, one of Jamaica's two major political parties needed a new leader. There were experienced politicians around Andrew Holness. Audley Shaw, Christopher Tufton, Kenneth Baugh, men with experience and ambitions of their own. But the JLP settled on Andrew Holness. There was no divisive leadership contest, and on October 23, 2011, at just 39 years old, Andrew Michael Holness was sworn in as Jamaica's 9th Prime Minister. Holness decided to seek his own mandate, and he called the general election for December 29, 2011. He was young. He represented generational change, and the JLP hoped that replacing the politically battered Bruce Golding with a fresh 39-year-old leader could reset the election. Across from him stood someone completely different. Portia Simpson Miller was no newcomer. She had spent decades building an emotional connection with sections of the Jamaican electorate. She had already been Prime Minister, and she wanted Jamaica House back. Election night came, and Jamaica delivered its answer. It wasn't close. The PNP won 42 seats. The JLP won just 21. Andrew Holness had been Prime Minister for only a little over 2 months, and now he was out. Andrew Holness went from Jamaica House back to the opposition benches. For many politicians, that could have been the end. And perhaps some inside the Jamaica Labour Party thought it should have been. Because the next threat to Andrew Holness would not come from Portia Simpson Miller. It would come from inside his own house. The 2011 defeat, you see, left the JLP wounded. And when a political party suffers a defeat that severe, eventually somebody asks, was the problem the leader? In 2013, Audley Shaw decided to find out. Shaw was no political lightweight. He had served as Minister of Finance. He was a senior figure inside the JLP, energetic, aggressive, and he had deep relationships throughout the party. So he challenged Andrew Holness for leadership of the Jamaica Labour Party. On November 10, 2013, JLP delegates voted. Andrew Holness received 2,704 votes. Audley Shaw received 2,012. Holness survived, but the period surrounding that leadership battle would also produce the controversial issue involving the resignation letters of opposition senators, a matter that eventually reached the courts and dealt Holness another political blow. But something was changing beneath the surface. The PNP was implementing a painful economic program. Jamaicans were feeling austerity. Portia Simpson Miller's government was becoming vulnerable. And Andrew Holness was changing too. The cautious young politician who inherited Jamaica House in 2011 had learned a brutal lesson. Nobody was going to give him the prime ministership again. If he wanted Jamaica House again, he would have to do so at the ballot box. And in 2016, he got his second chance. By early 2016, Andrew Holness had been waiting almost 5 years for another opportunity. The economy was showing signs of stabilization under a difficult IMF program. But Jamaicans had endured significant sacrifice, and Holness began presenting something different. Not revolution, not democratic socialism, not the ideological warfare that had defined earlier generations of Jamaican politics. His word was prosperity. The JLP campaigned on economic growth, jobs, tax reform, home ownership, and the promise that Jamaicans should be able to move from poverty to prosperity. Central to that promise was the bold plan to raise the personal income tax free threshold to 1.5 million. A proposal that captured the public's imagination, resonated deeply with working class Jamaicans, and became the signature policy that eventually tipped the balance to the Jamaica Labour Party's favor. Then came February 25, 2016, election day, when the dust settled. JLP 32 seats, PNP 31, 32 to 31, one seat. That was the difference between Andrew Holness returning to Jamaica House and spending another term in opposition. The man, decisively rejected in 2011, had finally won his own mandate. On March 3, 2016, Andrew Holness was sworn in as Prime Minister for the second time. But there was something almost terrifying about that victory. Because a one-seat parliamentary majority is not political security. It is political life on a tightrope. One resignation, one defection, one expected death, one internal revolt, and your majority can disappear. Andrew Holness had finally made it back to Jamaica House. Now he had to figure out how to stay there. And while he was doing that, another Holness had arrived in Parliament. You see, the 2016 election brought Juliet Holness, Andrew Holness's wife, into Parliament. She won St. Andrew East Rural. That made Andrew and Juliet Holness something unusual in Jamaican politics. A sitting Prime Minister and his wife serving simultaneously as elected members of Parliament. Juliet Holness would eventually rise to become Speaker of the House of Representatives. But in 2016, Andrew Holness's immediate problem wasn't dynasty, it was survival. And survival would require results. To understand the Holness years, we have to understand one uncomfortable fact about Jamaica. For decades, Jamaica had been carrying significant public debt burden. Interest payments consumed resources significantly. Economic growth remained weak, and Jamaica repeatedly returned to the international financial institutions for help. By the time Holness returned to power in 2016, Jamaica was already operating under an IMF-supported reform program negotiated by the previous PNP administration under Portia Simpson Miller and Finance Minister Peter Phillips. And this is important. If we are going to tell history fairly, we have to make it known that Andrew Holness did not create Jamaica's fiscal turnaround from scratch. The PNP had already begun the painful process. What the Holness government did, and did very well, unprecedented from previous governments, was a consequential decision to continue the fiscal discipline. Debt continued to fall. Jamaica completed its IMF program. Foreign reserves strengthened. Investor confidence improved. Unemployment eventually fell to historic lows. And Holness increasingly connected his political identity to that one word, prosperity. But there was a problem. Prosperity on paper doesn't always feel like prosperity at home. Supporters could point to the numbers: lower employment, lower debt, greater macroeconomic stability, investment even, construction climbing, housing growing. But ordinary Jamaicans could ask different questions. How much does chicken cost? How much does rent cost? Can my child afford a home? When will the water come? When will my road be fixed? How much of my salary disappears at the supermarket? There is Jamaica as measured by an economist, and there is Jamaica as experienced by Jamaicans. A prime minister has to govern both situations, both variables. And while Holness was trying to convince Jamaicans that prosperity was coming, another problem remained impossible to ignore. Murder, crime had haunted Jamaican governments for generations, and now it belonged to Andrew Holness. Gangs controlled communities, illegal guns flooded the streets, extortion became embedded in sections of the economy, families buried their sons, children grew up surrounded by violence. Holness responded with an aggressive security strategy. Zones of special operations, states of public emergency, greater investment in the Jamaican Constabulary Force, technology improvement, vehicles, intelligence gathering, pressure on gangs. Holness argued that extraordinary violence required extraordinary intervention. Critics pushed back. Human rights advocates raised concerns. The opposition challenged repeated emergency powers. And constitutional questions reached the courts. This became one of the defining tensions of the Holness years. How far should a government be allowed to go in the name of protecting its citizens? And crime wasn't the only issue where that question appeared. Holness wanted a national identification system, NIDS. The argument was straightforward: modernize government, reduce fraud, give Jamaicans secure identification, move Jamaica further into the digital age. But opponents raised serious questions around privacy, biometric data, and constitutional rights. In 2019, the Constitutional Court struck down the original NIDS law. For Andrew Holness, the message was significant. His government had political power, but the judiciary had remained the executive of something fundamental. A majority in Parliament does not place a government above the Constitution. The government later returned with a redesigned legislation. But another problem had already exploded: Petrojam. By 2018, allegations surrounding Jamaica's state-owned oil refinery were dominating political discussions. Questions were raised about hiring contracts, expenditure, travel, management, governance. The controversy reached cabinet. Energy Minister Andrew Wheatley eventually resigned. For a government selling itself on competence, Petrojam was damaging. Because economic management is one thing, integrity is another. And it introduced a question that would follow the Holness administration, when the PNP made allegations that eventually reached the office of the Prime Minister. But first, the world stopped. COVID-19 arrived in Jamaica. Borders closed, schools closed, businesses struggled, tourism collapsed, curfews became part of daily life, communities were quarantined. Andrew Holness became an almost constant presence through television in Jamaican homes. Then, in the middle of that uncertainty, an election was called for September 2020. Peter Phillips led the PNP. When the votes were counted, the result was devastating. JLP 49 seats, PNP 14. Think about the journey: 2011 defeat, 2016 survival, 2020 dominance. The young Prime Minister Jamaica had rejected the years earlier now controlled almost 4 out of every 5 seats in Parliament. Andrew Holness had become the most electorally powerful Jamaican Prime Minister of his generation. Then came a controversy every Jamaican could understand: money. In 2023, the government introduced major public sector compensation reforms. Teachers, nurses, police officers, civil servants, thousands of workers were affected. Then Jamaica saw the new salaries for the political directorate. The reaction was explosive. The government argued that political salaries had been suppressed for years and that the increases were part of the wider compensation restructuring. But many Jamaicans heard something much simpler. Politicians were giving themselves more money. And timing matters. Families were struggling with groceries, rent, transportation, electricity, mortgages. You see, you can tell people debt is falling. You can tell them unemployment is at record lows. But if someone is standing in the supermarket wondering what to put back because the money isn't enough, economic success can feel very far away. And that exposed perhaps the greatest contradiction of the Holness years. Economic stability matters, but eventually Jamaicans ask, when does stability become prosperity for me? Then the issue became even more personal. The Integrity Commission examined matters relating to Andrew Holness's statutory declarations. Holness strongly rejected suggestions of wrongdoing and challenged aspects of the process. His supporters argued that an investigation should never be treated as proof of guilt. His critics argued that a prime minister must be held to the highest possible standards of transparency. And while both principles matter, an allegation, however, is not a conviction. An investigation is not proof of guilt. For years, Andrew Holness had been hammered over Jamaica's murder rate. And Jamaicans repeatedly asked, where are the results? Then the numbers began moving. Murders started falling significantly, and the decline became large enough that Jamaicans could see that something was changing. If Jamaica can sustain that reduction, and sustain is the important word, it could become one of the most consequential achievements of the Holness era. Because governments can build highways, they can reduce debt, they can attract hotels. But if Jamaicans are afraid to live in their own communities, development means something very different. And by 2025, Holness had a record to defend. Economic stability, historically low unemployment, falling debt, infrastructure, housing, a declining murder rate. But he also had baggage, cost of living pressures, alleged corruption controversies, political salary increases, roads, water, questions about accountability. And after almost a decade in government, perhaps the most dangerous political problem of all, fatigue. The PNP that Holness demolished in 2020 was no longer led by Peter Phillips. It had a new leader, Mark Golding. The opposition began rebuilding. The PNP performed strongly in the 2024 local government elections. They were riding high. Polls tightened, and it became obvious that 2025 would not be another 49-14 walkover. For Andrew Holness, the stakes were enormous. If he lost, 2020 could be remembered as his high water mark. But if he won, he would do something no leader of the Jamaica Labour Party had ever accomplished: 3 consecutive general election victories. And on September 3, 2025, Jamaica went to the polls. When the votes were counted, Andrew Holness had done it again. JLP 35 seats, PNP 28, 3 consecutive victories. But the PNP had doubled its parliamentary representation from 14 to 28. So, Jamaica appeared to have sent Andrew Holness 2 messages at the same time. The first we are giving you another term. The second, don't get comfortable. And perhaps that makes 2025 more fascinating than 2020. You see, in 2020, Jamaica gave Holness domination. In 2025, Jamaica gave him another chance. Those are not the same thing. Now, stand back and look at Andrew Holness's journey. A 25-year-old MP, Minister of Education, Prime Minister at 39, defeated almost immediately, challenged for leadership of his own party, survived, returned to Jamaica House with 32 seats, then 49, then 35. The politician who once couldn't convince Jamaica to keep him as Prime Minister had learned how to make himself extraordinarily difficult to remove. So what changed? He became a better campaigner. The JLP became more sophisticated. Messaging became tighter. Organization became stronger. Social media became more important. Data became more important. And Holness developed a political style very different from the leaders who came before him. He wasn't Michael Manley. He wasn't Edward Seaga. He wasn't Portia Simpson Miller. He was never a Bruce Golding. Andrew Holness built something different. Control, message discipline, organization, patience, and above everything else, survival. He survived 2011. He survived Audley Shaw. He survived the Senate controversy. He survived the one-seat majority. He survived Petrojam. He survived constitutional battles. He survived COVID. He survived the political salary controversy. He survived scrutiny of his financial affairs. And he survived an opposition resurgence in 2025. Andrew Holness is still there. But this is where the story changes, because survival is not the same thing as greatness. Winning elections is not the same thing as transforming a country. Political longevity is not the same thing as legacy. Legacy is what remains when the motorcade is gone. When Andrew Holness eventually leaves Jamaica House, what Jamaica will he leave behind? Will history remember the dramatic reduction in Jamaica's national debt? Historically low unemployment? Highways? Housing infrastructure? A sustained reduction in murder? A more modern Jamaican state? Perhaps even a Jamaican republic? Or will it remember controversies over accountability, political salaries, cost of living pressures, bad roads, communities still waiting for reliable water, young Jamaicans who still believe their greatest opportunities exist somewhere outside Jamaica? Maybe history will remember all of it, because prime ministers are rarely simple heroes or villains. They are human beings entrusted with enormous power. And power eventually reveals both achievements and failures. Andrew Holness now faces perhaps the most difficult stage of his political career. In the beginning, governments can blame what they inherited. After 5 years, that becomes harder. After 10 years, people start looking at you. Andrew Holness has governed continuously since March 2016. So increasingly, the Jamaica around him belongs to his record. The roads, his record. The water, his record. Crime, his record. Housing, his record. Education, his record. Economic growth, his record. Accountability, his record. That is the price of longevity. Eventually, you become the establishment you once promised to change. And yet, Andrew Holness' story remains unfinished. Maybe his greatest accomplishment hasn't happened yet. Maybe his greatest mistake hasn't happened yet. Hopefully not. Maybe Jamaica becomes a republic under his leadership. Maybe the decline in murder becomes permanent. Maybe economic stability finally translates into prosperity for ordinary Jamaicans and that they can feel it in their pocket. We don't know. And that is what makes Andrew Holness different from every other prime minister we have examined. We are writing his history while he's still making it. So his final grade cannot be written today. The examination is still in progress. And that brings us to the end of part 8 of our 9-part series on the prime ministers of Jamaica. But some of you have been counting, and perhaps you have noticed something. Andrew Holness is Jamaica's current prime minister, yet this is only part 8. So, who's left for part 9? Well, I did something deliberately when we began this series. I saved Jamaica's first prime minister for last, Sir Alexander Bustamante. Yes, chronologically, Bustamante should have been part 1. Instead, he will be part 9. And I did that for a reason. Because now that we have traveled through the men and women who inherited the country after him, we can finally return to the man who stood at the beginning. The labor rebellion, the trade union movement, the creation of the Jamaica Labour Party, his extraordinary relationship and rivalry with his cousin Norman Manley, the road to independence, and the man who, when Jamaica became an independent nation in 1962, became its first prime minister, Sir Alexander Bustamante. The first prime minister will be the last prime minister in our series. And when we tell his story, this entire 9-part journey comes full circle. We end exactly where independent Jamaica began in August 1962. Next week, we go back into the beginning, and together we bring this journey home. Until then, my dear friends, remember, out of many, one people, one nation, one Jamaica, the land we love, under God. Dear Jamaica, we need to talk. See you next time.
Now, my friends, the elections are over. We must reunite and refocus on the business of the nation. The time has come. Where we must get over the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat.
Here we come,
one people, one nation,
standing tall,
under God,
strong and free,
Jamaica,
the land we love.